Thank you everyone for coming. This is the faculty colloquium sponsored by the Provost's office, and this is the second year we've done this. I've been really pleased with the research that's been presented here, and I have really high hopes for today's presentation by Dr. Kimberly Majeski. Dr. Majeski received her BA from Cumberland University and her MDiv and DMin from Anderson University. She is the Associate Professor of Biblical Studies here and joined the SOTCM in 2008. Dr. Majeski is a conference speaker, a women's retreat leader, and a radio personality with the Church of God's Viewpoint Ministry. Before joining the seminary faculty, Dr. Majeski served Anderson University as campus pastor and as ministry coordinator of the Women of the Church of God. She writes a weekly blog and is the founder of Butterflies of Hope Outreach. Dr. Majeski is also an ordained minister in the Church of God, and as you can see, she will be talking today about reclaiming our time, resurrecting the story of biblical Prisca from the ashes of patriarchy. Please help me welcome Dr. Majeski.
Thank you all so much for coming over here this afternoon. I am excited to present this research and then to have some time at the end to engage with any questions or comments that you have. It's a subject that I love, and you just have to try to get me to stop talking about it. So I want to make sure that there's time for you to have questions and interact. We live right now in a moment when Me Too and Time's Up and enough hashtags have created an unmistakable synergy, and the church and the academy must take note. While untold numbers of women have fallen prey to sexual predators and sexual violence, when equal pay and appointment has not been yet realized, women across the nation are locking arms and decrying the injustice. Many women in the church are standing alongside them, and for us, we are hungry for stories of our mothers. We are thirsty for the truth of the gospel and to see women restored to positions of leadership just as they were in the Jesus movement and the early church. We're working to dismantle the dominant reading of texts from the heights of patriarchal perspective, and we are leaning in and digging deep and turning over stones to recover the lost stories of women at the center of the gospel narrative and to discover how these jewels of history got lost along the way. Today, I will present to you the culmination of years of work that has really began as a frustrated doctoral student, serving in a Wesleyan Holiness Church tradition who boasted of women clergy since the days of its inception, but had been leveled to a homogeneous panel of leadership composed of middle-aged white men. Nothing against middle-aged white men. I was spending my summers in research and writing at the University of Notre Dame, and I would return to town and make my way to Church of God gatherings where I neither saw my gender represented in the leadership nor anyone of my ilk gathered around the tables. I had studied the New Testament since childhood, and it had been the center of my scholarship for the most of my adult life. I knew they were there. I had read their names: Phoebe, Junia, Lois, Eunice, Mary, and Mary, and Mary, and Salome, and Joanna, and Husa's wife, and Chloe, and Dorcas, and Lydia, and Prisca. But somehow their stories had slipped away from us, like sand sifted through our fingers, and there was nothing to hold on to, except the witness of Scripture. The witness of Scripture that said they had been there. So it began with coffee, as I sat across the table from my friend and colleague and mentor, Dr. Candida Moss, in the Starbucks of Our Lady in the Student Center at Notre Dame. She had rescheduled a hair appointment to meet with me between classes and had taken time to sit down. And in her, I had found a scholar who would hear my questions and take them to heart, who valued my pursuit and was committed to helping me find a way to begin. The more I served Jesus and women, the more profound the absence of any knowledge of our heritage in the gospel narrative has become, and the more determined I am to hold high the lamp and shine a light on the evidence to the contrary. It is simply not okay for women made in the image of God to have no sense of their role in the history of the story of God. As a responsible historian, at the outset, I would like to state what is true. I am a woman, have been for some 40 years. I study scripture as a woman with lived experience as a female, and I will not apologize for this. We bring who we are, where we've been, what has happened to us, what we need, to the process of our engagement with the text. I believe this is how God intended it to be. In every case, when we interpret scripture as humans in a lived context, this is what we bring to that process. And we simply need to state that fact. For this reason, context, story, and community are threads we tug at for understanding, and sometimes the gaps tell us more than the words. We are only able to find where we stand once we begin to uncover the passage and how it functioned in its original time and place. Then we can move forward to walk and apply the wisdom to our own place and time. This audience should know that I have followed these women across the globe, from Indiana to Jerusalem, to Jordan and Syria, to Rome, to Thessaloniki, to Philippi, to Corinth, Athens, and ancient Ephesus. I have pored over sacred manuscripts and touched centuries-old stones. I have squinted to read epigraphy, and I have researched and written and submitted. I have presented and connected the dots for the past 7 years. I've also been challenged, criticized, and dismissed. Nevertheless, I persist. In the pages of the New Testament, we find beautiful imagery and noble typography, contours of women who have gone before us and left their mark. As women, as historians, we are hungry to know their stories, to wrap them in flesh and blood, the flesh and blood of real people who lived in real time and space. We want to know these ancient women who forged a way through the bonds of patriarchy and male-dominated society to be found at the feet of Jesus, in the shadow of the empty tomb, and at the right hand of Paul. It is with such a prominent member of the Pauline circle and early church leader that this research is concerned. Let us commence our search for Saint Prisca. We want to begin, of course, with the canonical witness. And I want you to know that the subject of my sabbatical that I enjoyed with the Faculty Development Funds this fall allowed me the opportunity to go to Rome and to study for a short week, but it was a full week. This is me on the Palatine Hill. I got to see lots of ancient sites. This is, of course, the Colloquium. Some 5,000 people were persecuted. This was built during the time of Vespasian. This is Pompeii. I got to spend a day down in the south in Naples and got to walk across and through the ancient city of Pompeii that had sort of been untouched since the great volcano that hit there. And it's this beautiful world where you kind of walk through and picture into antiquity. And I had pizza every single day and gelato, but that got ugly, so I won't show you that. But to set this up and to set this experience up of where I was able to connect and sort of connect the dots when I got to Rome, I want to kind of give you some foundational information. And so to begin with any conversation about Prisca, we want to begin with the conversation of the biblical Prisca. This is where we find our jumping off point. Prisca is mentioned, of course, in the canonical New Testament. There are 6 citations who reference, where Prisca is referenced in the New Testament, in Acts and in the Pauline epistles. And then once in the disputed Pauline epistle, 2 Timothy 4:19. In all but 2 of these references, Prisca is named first. However, Luke will use the diminutive of her name, which was Priscilla. So that's like going from calling me Kimberly to calling me Kim. The longer form of her name is her nickname. Priscilla is sort of the diminutive of her name. My mother would always insist that you call me Kimberly, because that's my full God-given Christian name. Same thing with Prisca. So we're not exactly sure what to make of the variants. Metzger and von Harnack and Holmes and lots of other scholars have spent a lot of time doing work to discuss how the Western texts were sort of biased against women and against the witness of the role of women in the way that they're documented. You might be somewhat familiar with the fact that sometimes in some manuscripts, Junia, for instance, is called Junia, and other places Junius, the male form of her name. Same thing kind of happens with Prisca, and those variances tend to show up in the Western text. And that's something we won't have to get down into the weeds of today, but just want to give a nod to the fact that is true. What we can see here is that this is a woman who is married and who is a part of the Pauline circle. In narrative terms, according to Acts 18, Prisca is the wife of Aquila, who is a Jew from Pontus. She and her husband traveled to Corinth from Italy after Claudius' edict, which expels the Jews from Rome, in about 49 CE. During their time in Corinth, they meet Paul, who eventually lives with them, and they work together as, like Paul, they are leather workers. And after Paul spends considerable time in Corinth, he, together with Prisca and Aquila, sail for Syria in Ephesus. And from Ephesus, Paul sails to Syria en route to Jerusalem and leaves Prisca and Aquila behind in Ephesus, where they encounter Apollos. Apollos is an Alexandrian Jew from Egypt who was learned in the scriptures, but who only knew of John's baptism. So that Prisca and Aquila took him aside, and the verb here is ektithemi. You can interpret that however you wish, but literally in the Greek, she taught or explained or expounded with him, and then later wrote him a recommendation to the churches of Achaia. So this is why I refer to Prisca as a seminary professor. In surveying the undisputed Pauline texts of 1 Corinthians and Romans, we glean that Prisca and Aquila housed early communities of Jesus followers in their homes, both in Ephesus and in Rome. More than this, we see Paul giving thanks for the couple and referring to them as persons for whom the whole Gentile community gives thanks. Quote, "Greet Prisca and Aquila, who work with me in Christ Jesus and who risk their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the Gentile churches give thanks. Greet also the church in their house." Romans 16, 3-5. Nicola Denzi points out that Prisca's position is clear. What we can tell from the biblical text is that she is the wife of Aquila, that she is the companion of Paul, and that she is a co-laborer in the gospel. The Greek word there is sunergos. Nicola Denzi points out that what this means is she's not under Paul. She's not someone who is Paul's flunky, right? Prisca is a co-laborer. She works together with Paul in the proclamation and the spreading of the gospel. She's a co-worker in the Lord. In the Deutero-Pauline text, 2 Timothy, if we accept the writing of this as from Rome, it confirms that Prisca and Aquila are serving as leaders of a house church in Ephesus. According to Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who argues for the Pauline authenticity of this letter, the greeting proves that Prisca and Aquila leave Rome and return to Ephesus. Murphy O'Connor argues that Paul differs here in sending greetings to a few rather than to many, as he does in other letters. But here he chooses his closest and oldest companions. We have further fragmentary evidence of Prisca and Aquila's residence in Ephesus from the apocryphal Acts of Paul. In this account, preserved now only in the Coptic Bodmer papyrus, Paul comes to Ephesus and visits the home of, in this case, Aquila and Priscilla, where they jubilantly receive him, so much so that they have all night long prayer vigils, and the visitation from the angel of the Lord appears in their midst. While visiting their home, Paul urges them to make ready for the coming of Pentecost and relays to them the stories of his persecutions in Damascus. Perhaps we are helped here as we seek to draw evidence regarding Prisca so that we might have a more complete biography, to consult some further research here about the prominence and limitations of Prisca's role. Though Ephesus is a city in Asia Minor, it was steeped in Roman culture, and it's a preeminent city of the Roman Empire. The Romans took control in 133 BCE, and so the customs of the Roman household and the society had become norm in this beautiful city. In the house church paradigm then, Prisca's role, like so many other female leaders in the Pauline circle, is quite within the realm of acceptable behavior. For the Roman matrona and mater familias, this is their role. In this context, the Roman woman assumed authority as guardian of the home and was entrusted with the supervision of goods, staff, and the virtue of the home. Thus, the role of Prisca as domina and overseer of the community that gathered in her home was quite within the Roman practice, especially in concordia with her husband Aquila. It is only as this role takes on the public context of ecclesia that there's indeed a clash with Roman practice. While women had authority in their homes as granted to them by their husbands, women had no authority in politics or public places. So we do have evidence, some of female patronage in the different colloquia. We're not certain of the terms of what they had to do to become accepted members. But by and large, women were relegated to the space of the home, and men were relegated to the public offices and the public spaces. And so when we talk about Paul and the Pauline church and the early church, it's really important to understand how that sort of all grew up. Because Paul needs places to be accepted, because his message is not necessarily welcome at the synagogue, what he does is connect himself to women and typically women of means who have influential friends, and they can invite them over for some kind of dates and figs and talk about Jesus. And so Paul isn't, quote, a feminist in any sense of the word, except that he's this practitioner of the gospel. And so he's all about equality and everyone having a place. But it's a practical move that he makes, because when he decides to proclaim the kerygma in the homes, then what happens is women are very naturally in places of leadership because they oversee the homes. And that's why we have so many women in leadership in that early Jesus movement and in the Pauline circle. In terms of intertextual evidence, that's near the sum of what we have. We turn now to some critical references from the church fathers. And an interesting piece of it emerges from 4th century Epiphanius in his Indices Apostolorum, where he lists a certain Priscus as episcopus of Colophon, which is a city near Ephesus. The male form of Prisca is listed here just above the male form of Junia, who is listed also as the episcopus of Apamea in Syria. So very interestingly, in the 4th century, you have both of these names, though they are given and listed in Epiphanius's log as men, because in the 4th century he couldn't at all envision that bishops would have been women. But in fact, these are the names of two very prominent women in the early Pauline circle. We can place Prisca for sure in Ephesus And we know that Paul entrusted the church there to her leadership, she and Aquila. And so, given the evidence, it isn't far-fetched at all that it was not Prisca who was the bishop of Colophon outside of Ephesus, but it was our sister Prisca. Perhaps St. John of Chrysostom offers a window into the impact of Prisca's zeal, at least as it was interpreted by the early Christian centuries. In Homily 10 of his collection on the pastoral epistles and Philemon, he expounds on the closing salutations of 2 Timothy 4, describing Priscilla as her primary placement before Aquila as, quote, I suppose more zealous and more faithful, for she had received Apollos, or it might have been done differently. Chrysostom explains that Paul's mention of the couple, quote, conveyed a demonstration of esteem and love and a participation in much grace. For the bare salutation of the holy and blessed man was sufficient to fill him with grace who received it. Chrysostom gives further insight into impact of Prisca's fervor as he relates to the martyr stories and the legend concerning many from the Pauline circle at what he presumes to be the end of Paul's life. So this is a long quote, but it's worth it. This is from Chrysostom. This Linus, some say, was second bishop of the Church of Rome after Peter. And Claudia, you see how zealous for the faith the women were, how ardent. Such was Priscilla and this Claudia, already crucified, already prepared for battle. But why, when there were so many faithful, does he mention only these women? Manifestly because they in purpose had already withdrawn from worldly affairs, and were illustrious above other. What for a woman as such meets not with any impediments. It is the work of divine grace that this sex should be impeded only in the affairs of this life, or rather not even in them. For a woman undertakes no small share of the whole administration, being the keeper of the house. And without her, not even political affairs could be properly conducted. For if their domestic concerns were in a state of confusion and disorder, those who are engaged in public affairs would be kept at home, and political business would be ill managed, so that neither in those matters, as neither in spiritual, is she inferior, for she is able, if so inclined, to endure 1,000 deaths, according to many women who have suffered martyrdom, not such small flame disturbing her, and to show forth modesty and gravity, and holiness, without which no one shall see the Lord, and contempt of wealth, if she will, and in short, all other virtues. So, I don't know, Dr. Hawkins, I feel like we need to put that on a t-shirt or something, but that's an important quote from St. John of the Church, talking here about the importance of the role of women in the early church and how they stood as martyrs. And he wants to make the point that even in the context of the Roman Empire, if the women hadn't seen to the matters of the home, then the matters of public office would have also fallen apart. That relationship between both entities had been really important for the offices of state. In the early church, martyr stories functioned as a means to edify the church and to spur early believers into faith. Though it has been proved that no widespread empire-sanctioned persecution of the Christians occurred until the 3rd century under Decius, there were isolated incidents, to be sure, between 64 and 250. Additionally, martyr stories were often collected and reshaped to harness the status and authority that the title conferred on the deceased and on the community, preserving his or her memory. In fact, as patronage to martyrs and pilgrimage to sacred sites began to flourish, stories were often combined for economic and practical reasons. This seems in part to have been the case with Prisca, as we have several stories of early Christian women who bear this name and seem to be related to the Prisca of the Pauline circle. We turn now to consider these narratives. So when I got off the plane in Rome, this is where I went. We flew in, we arrived at 7 a.m. in the morning. By the time we got to our apartment, which was also on the Aventine Hill, you'll see in just a minute. We were so excited that we went and got some Freddo espresso. If you want to have a laugh, ask people in Rome for a cold coffee. They think you're crazy. But I asked for one of those, and then we went out to see the sights, because I knew I only had 8 days. And so there's so much to see in Rome, and there's so much to do, but I really wanted to focus my attention on these early church holy sites, particularly those that had to do with Prisca. So on the same hill where my apartment was, on the Aventine Hill, is this church, probably the oldest church in Rome, the Church of St. Prisca. And we got there, and it was closed. And so we do what Americans do. We beat on the doors. We go talk to the neighbors. We were pushy. Anyway, we found out we could come back in 3 hours and it would be open. So that's okay, no problem. We just walked down the hill to Circus Maximus and spent a couple hours there, and then back up the hill and to the Church of St. Prisca. This is a beautiful, beautiful old church. And it is built, the story is that it's built on top of the home of Prisca and Aquila. Now, we don't have any archaeological evidence per se that says it was exactly on top of this site. What is exactly under this site is actually a Mithraeum, which is an ancient pagan worship site that dates to the 3rd century. But just down from here, we have found a church, a house that we believe was a place where early Christian worship happened. Lots of relics like pottery with the Chi Rho embossed on it, and different items have been founded there. And so what we believe then is the house is in this vicinity, near where the church is later built. This is a small church. These, as you can see, there's buildings kind of on either side of it. Now it's a parochial school, and there's lots going on. There's a hotel just next door. But inside it is this beautiful and incredible sanctuary of peace. And there are lots of stories about Prisca in connection to this church. So one of the stories is that this church is founded in memory of biblical Prisca, who you see here being baptized by Peter. This is on the altar. And the other kind of competing story that we have about who this church is named after is the martyr Prisca. You can kind of just make out that fresco there. I have a better one, I think, here. There is a young woman whose name is Prisca, and she's supposedly an early martyr, martyred under Claudius, and she is also named Priscilla, and she is beheaded after they try to take her life several different ways. And a lot of the martyr stories, these martyrs overcome the fire and the beasts, and they endure in their faith, and then finally, in some way, they die. And so we have these two stories, these two Priscas associated with this church. The 7th century guides for pilgrims who travel to the city of Rome list several points of interest. Cemeteries for seekers to visit. One of the most prominent stops was the catacombs of Priscilla, which held the remains of many holy people, including the Roman martyr Prisca. We believe that the initial structure of the Priscilla catacombs was built as a burial complex for the Roman noble family, the Achillii Glabriones. Before we discuss the burial chamber itself, let us sort through this Prisca and Priscilla differentiation here. It can be hard to decipher these stories out because over the years, history and legend have become blurred, and so we have sort of a couple different things happening here. So we have this idea that there's this Roman woman who is affiliated with the Achillii Glabriones, who owned this place, this area, where the catacombs are where the catacombs are constructed, where biblical Prisca's remains lay, and where martyr Prisca's remains are taken. And then we have the idea that that all of these Priscas may be the same one or interrelated some way. So Jerome Murphy O'Connor is the first person I ever heard posit the idea that the Achillei Glabriones, while they may be connected to this wealthy woman Prisca, who was the owner of the catacombs, are also connected to Priscilla and Aquila. For him, it's a short walk from Achillei Glabriones to Aquila. And he thinks maybe the truth of it is Aquila was a slave in the household of the Achillei Glabriones, and in the Roman culture took on the name of his masters, which happened. And it got shortened and morphed into Aquila. He thinks maybe it's possible that Prisca and Aquila were both slaves in the house of the Achillei Glabriones. But our biblical Prisca is connected to this famous wealthy patrician family, ancient family in Rome as well. So we know that there are those kind of streams that are all kind of feeding into each other. The other thing we know about the 4th century church that I just showed you, that is, it's affiliated with Prisca, but it's also affiliated with Pudens. And Pudens was a senator who's also a member of this wealthy family. We find an artifact that is actually a nameplate of Pudens near this house, right, that's under the street that was discovered that we think might have been owned by Prisca and Aquila. Or maybe it was Pudens' house and Prisca and Aquila gathered there. Some people believe that Priscilla was the mother of Pudens, who would later welcome St. Peter into their home. This is the baptismal font that they say that Peter used to baptize Prisca, which probably hard to believe because he probably did it out in a river somewhere like we do in the Church of God. But this is there in the church and still a prominent part of the legend and the lore that St. Peter visited this place and that this was where he baptized Prisca. We also have evidence that his chair was found here. So in the early days, the Pope, the father of the church, who was first Peter and then Linus and on down, they would sit in these large high-backed chairs, and they would kind of, I don't want to say judge, but interact with the people. They would teach, right? This is why today we have chairs of history, and the Janet Brewer Chair of Library Science at Anderson University, because this is how professors would also sit and sort of convene and oversee a gathering. And so we have evidence that says Peter's chair was found here and then moved to the high altar of St. Peter in the Basilica after that was constructed. So that's interesting, that Peter worshiped and convened and sat among the early church gatherers in this site. So tradition surrounding Prisca's connection to Peter and Paul has endured. A codex discovered having belonged to Peter the deacon features 3 sermons concerning Peter and Aquila. Historian of the Benedictine Abbey in Monte Cassino writes that the apostolic authority consecrated the blessed house of Aquila and Prisca in honor of the Catholic Church and gave it the name of Holy and Divided. In the church, the apostolic authority ordered a baptistry with a perpetual fountain. The home alluded to was discovered close to the church of St. Prisca on the Aventine. And so many scholars believe that this is the church that was associated with Prisca. Ruth Hoppen goes as far to say that Prisca was a part of the Achillei Glabriones family, that Aquila is a slave in their house. They, I guess, fall in love and leave Rome under the Edict of Claudius and go to Corinth and become married. And that Prisca is, in fact, the author of the book of Hebrews. Because of all the female imagery throughout, she's the one in the Pauline circle who ends up doing that. And her absence from the absence of any author's name is an argument for it having been a woman who penned it. That's another paper I'll tell you about another time. Okay. So now we need to talk about our 19th century findings and what we can learn from the catacombs of Priscilla. This was really the high point of my trip. Like, this is when I just fell on my knees and wept like an idiot. But it was powerful. You know, I've been living with this image for years, and this is an image called the Fractioponis. It's supposedly the Catholic Church refers to this as the breaking of the bread, and there's this, you know, a lot of debate about like who these people are. You know, obviously this is a man celebrating Eucharist, only they kind of look like women because they have long hair and earrings, and their dresses are long. But of course you can't say that in certain groups. So I was all prepared for our guide to, you know, kind of toe the line and tell us who these people were. These are found in the Priscilla's catacombs. We have this incredible archaeology and these incredible frescoes and stelas that were discovered in these catacombs. In 1888, Giovanni Battista de Rossi discovered a portion of these catacombs that had been ruined by the barbarians and raids of Pope Innocent X and Clement IX, who excavated the funerary lands in search of treasures. But de Rossi's protege, Wilpert, developed a compound to dissolve lime deposits, and they were able to uncover many of these frescoes. So, of course, de Rossi and all the good brothers of the 19th century saw here all these 5 men and 1 woman, 6 men and 1 woman celebrating Eucharist. But we have trouble with that because of how the image kind of looks to us, and the fact that we have short skirt, long skirts to the ankle, and looks like our hair is swept up in some of this, and all of these things. But we want to know what this is doing in the catacombs devoted to, that are named for some woman called Priscilla on a land that was property connected to the Achillei Glabriones. In 2013, what happened was the Vatican released these other frescoes that were in this same catacomb, and images beyond this Greek chapel. These are one of the new images that have been released. You can see here, you know, like these little top knots. There you go, Hannah. Right? They're rocking their top knots back there. But it looks like lots of women pouring into a space. Some of it is erased, and we can't see exactly what's going on. But it's interesting to us. In the Greek chapel, and down past the Greek chapel, we have all of these beautiful images. I mean, these date somewhere between the 1st and 3rd century. And it's amazing that we're able to see this. When we were in this part, you know, you can't take pictures, so these aren't my pictures. These are pictures that I got off the internet. But our guide, you know, took us, and he said, you know, you all, I mean, I know what the Vatican says upstairs, but these are clearly women gathering here. And I high-fived him, which I think caught him off guard. But I was so prepared for him to give me the static line. And he was a he was a student of archaeology, and he said what he saw. He said, these are women. And he talked about sort of all the imagery being in the Greek chapel and throughout the catacombs devoted to women. We find images of Thecla, of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Susanna. In fact, one of the new images that have been uncovered, we think, is the earliest image of the Madonna, of Jesus and a baby. Now, it might just be a woman and a baby, but it looks like an allusion to Mary and Jesus, which would be the oldest one we have presently. We have images of holy women adorning the walls in the tomb of St. Prisca. So, what was going on here? Maybe the tomb of St. Prisca was a safe place, a quiet place where women could gather, could remember, and could celebrate the Eucharist unhindered by the political turmoil or the suppression of women in the church that existed above the ground. The medieval Christians who made pilgrimage to the catacombs of Priscilla came there to see the bones of first century friend and co-laborer of Paul host to Peter. We know her bones remained there until the 9th century, when they were moved by Pope Leo IV and are now reported lost. Though her bones are lost to us, perhaps a portrait of her has been restored. Here we have surveyed texts and tradition and archaeological findings to that end. In a time when the debate over the ordination of women persists in the church, we can all give thanks that these images of holy women who went before us, and if we're willing to search them out, they still hold hope to light our way. I want to draw your attention to this image here on the back wall. This is just what I could not get away from. This is a fresco that was just made public in 2013, as I mentioned, found in the Priscillan catacombs. What they call this is a cursus vita, so a life story of a particular woman. The argument among the masses is whether or not this veiled woman is celebrating or leading Mass. What we know is that early church holy women are before the 4th century, really driven out of leadership of the church. And so it's conceivable that what happened was what was happening in other catacombs, that worshipers went to these catacombs to light candles, to say prayers, to celebrate Eucharist, and to have worship services with people who had gone before them, with the martyrs who they honored and who they believed were now in the company of Jesus. And so it makes sense that women would have gathered in a place where a very prominent early church holy woman was buried, and her martyr story having been that she was killed under the persecution of Nero when Paul was. And then that this life story is sort of being painted out here. And so the question I want to ask is it really so difficult to imagine that Prisca had a daughter she named Prisca, who was martyred under Claudius, who after that sadness happened, they travel to Corinth and encounter Paul, and she becomes this incredible preacher, teacher, leader, church planner for the rest of her life. So what if this, in the catacombs of Priscilla, is the cursus vita of Prisca, biblical Prisca, friend to Paul, co-laborer in the church. This is maybe her marriage to Aquila here, and here, holding her child, maybe that's Prisca, her daughter, who is lost and one of the first martyrs. And then maybe this is how she spends the rest of her life, preaching and teaching and leading God's church. And maybe this is where they laid her. We know this is where they laid her when she died. And maybe this is where women came to gain encouragement from her life and the story of her testimony. Thank you.